Assalamu alaikum. In Neurological Physical Therapy series, it is our first lecture, which is a brief discussion on anatomy and physiology of nervous system. Basically, if we talk about the nervous system, it is the decision and communication center of our body. It is the center, it is the head of our body, which decide that what our body has to do. And the body work is basically divided into different physiological systems. For example, gastrointestinal system, cardiovascular system, renal system, respiratory system, reproductive system, endocrine system, etc. So basically, the nervous system is a unique system which controls all the other systems of the body. It is the decision center, it is the head of our body which decides what our body has to do. And it is a communication between different physiological systems of our body. Nervous system is basically a system which enables us to see, walk, talk, think, behave. It is responsible for our IQ level, our intelligence, our social behavior. Nervous system is divided into central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is the system which contains the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is basically the extension of central nervous system. The extensions which originate from brain are known as the cranial nerves, and there are 12 pairs of cranial nerve. And the extension of spinal cord are known as the spinal nerves, and there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Basically, these 12 cranial nerves and 31 spinal nerves are divided into somatic or autonomic nerves, depending whether they are supplying a voluntary muscles or they are controlling an involuntary action. Basically, how nervous system work: from receptor, afferent nerve fibers take sensory information towards the central nervous system. These receptors can be visual, auditory, chemo, somatosensory, etc. And then central nervous system generates a response and brings a motor information towards the periphery, towards the effectors. And these effectors can be any viscera, any gland, or any skeletal muscle. Now let's discuss about the structure of brain. The brain structure looks like a flower, in which we have is a brain stem, and there is a cloudy structure like petals, which is basically the cerebral cortex. This is the overall the cloudy structure is the cerebral cortex, and here the structure we have is the brain stem. The most lowest structure in the brain stem is the medulla oblongata. Above medulla oblongata we have is pons, and above pons we have is the midbrain. Above midbrain there is a very important structure present, which is the hypothalamus, and above hypothalamus we have is thalamus. There is a scattered mass of nuclei present around the thalamus, and this scattered mass is known as the basal ganglia. On the posterior side of brainstem we have is a very special structure, which is cerebellum. Cerebellum is the most oldest part of the brain. And the most important and the most largest part of the brain is the cerebral cortex, which is further divided into two cerebral hemispheres, which are further divided into 4 lobes. The brain stem further continue as spinal cord while passing through the foramen magnum. Let's discuss about the function of brain. The cerebellum, which is the oldest part of brain, is basically a structure which is involved in the maintenance of posture, balance, and coordination of movement. Cerebellum basically has 3 functional divisions. First one, connect it with the spinal cord, and this is known as spinocerebellum, which is basically linked with the maintenance of muscle tone. Second part of the cerebellum is connected with the vestibular apparatus, and it is known as the vestibulocerebellum. Vestibulocerebellum is the structure which is basically involved in the maintenance of balance and equilibrium of the body. Vestibular apparatus is a special structure which is present in ear, and it is basically involved in maintaining the balance. And if there is a defect in vestibular apparatus, then the person might suffer from vertigo, nausea, vomiting, etc. And the third part of the cerebellum connects it with the cerebral cortex, and this is known as the corticocerebellum or cerebrocerebellum. This part is basically involved in the planning and in action or in deciding of the voluntary movement. Second structure we have is the brain stem. Brain stem is involved in the consciousness of a person, as brain stem is basically a structure which form a special system which is known as reticular activating system. Reticular activating system is a system which is formed by the nuclei present in brainstem, the nuclei present in pons, medulla and midbrain, and the fibers of ascending and descending tracts of spinal cord. And this reticular activating system is basically involved in many involuntary functions, for example, consciousness, breathing, heart rate, etc. Next, if we talk about the different areas of the cerebral cortex, the cerebral cortex is divided into two cerebral hemispheres. This is the lateral view, and in this you are looking towards a cerebral hemisphere, which is further divided into four lobes. The lobe which is present on the interior side is known as the frontal lobe, and the lobe which is present on posterior side is known as the occipital lobe. Inferiorly we have is the temporal lobe, and superiorly we have is the parietal lobe. Frontal lobe is further divided into two parts, in which on the posterior side we have is this structure is basically the precentral cortex, and on interior side we have is the prefrontal cortex. The precentral cortex is basically the motor area which is involved in the control of voluntary movements, whereas the prefrontal cortex is the area which is involved in higher mental function. It is the area which enables us to solve problem, to think, to behave with someone. It is responsible for our mood, memory, behavior, thinking, intelligence, etc. Next we have is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is the lobe which is the sensory lobe, and it controls our all the sensations. It is further divided into three areas: somesthetic area 1, somesthetic area 2, and somesthetic association area. These three areas are basically involved in controlling the sensations. These sensations are mechanical or they can be kinesthetic sensation. It also enables a person to be aware about its body's parts, as it is also a sense. There are receptors present in joints which tell us that our joint or limb is in which position. Next, on the posterior side we have is the occipital lobe, and occipital lobe is basically the lobe which is visual, and it is linked with the vision, and it also control the visual field and visual acuity. Our second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve, it basically brings information from eye to the occipital lobe. The memory related to vision is also stored in the occipital lobe. And the last lobe we have is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is the lobe which is present on the inferior lateral side, and it is the auditory lobe. It is linked with the ear, as our ear has two functions. The first one is hearing, and second one is the balance and equilibrium due to the presence of vestibular apparatus. So the temporal lobe is linked with the hearing, the memory related with hearing, the translation of hearing and auditory stimulus, and the balance and equilibrium of the body. There are two speech centers present in brain. First one is the Wernicke's area, which is present in the temporal lobe. Wernicke's area is a sensory as well as a motor area. Its sensory function is that it helps in the interpretation of an auditory or visual stimulus. It helps in understanding of the stimulus. Whereas its motor function is the formulation of words and thoughts which a person wants to speak. And the motor area of speech, which is the Broca's area, it is basically responsible for the vocalization. Mean the word a person is speaking is basically a function of Broca's area. Cranial nerves are the nerves which originate from the brain, and they are 12 pairs. The first and the second cranial nerve, which is the olfactory and optic, they originate from the cerebral cortex, while the remaining 10 from 3 to 12 originate from the brain stem. Besides controlling the involuntary functions such as consciousness, heart rate, breathing, etc., brainstem also have the nuclei which basically controls the function of the remaining 10 cranial nerves. The first cranial nerve is olfactory, second is optic, then we have is the oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducent, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. These 12 pairs of cranial nerves are named 1, 2, 3 according to the order they are originating from the brain. Next we'll have is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is basically a structure which function is to transport information from periphery to central nervous system to brain and from brain to the periphery. It is just a path or a medium for the exchange of information. If we see the cross section of spinal cord, we have a white matter outside and a H-shaped gray matter inside the spinal cord. The gray matter, there is a difference between white and gray matter, that the white matter is white in color because it contains the myelinated nerve fibers. It contains the myelinated and non-myelinated both nerve fibers, but due to the presence of this myelin sheath, it appears white in color. Whereas the gray matter consists of the nuclei. It consists of the cell bodies. This shaped gray matter is divided into anterior horn or ventral horn and dorsal horn. On the ventral horn, there is the ventral root of spinal cord enter, and the ventral root of spinal cord is always motor in function. And on posterior horn, on dorsal horn, the dorsal root of spinal cord enters, and the dorsal root of spinal cord is always the sensory root. It brings information from sensory receptor to the spinal cord, and the motor root take information from spinal cord towards the effectors. On anterior side we have is the anterior median fissure, and on posterior side we have is the posterior median sulci. The fissure is a clear cut which is dividing a structure into two parts, whereas a sulci is a depression. From this fissure and sulci we can differentiate between the anterior and posterior side of the spinal cord. The structure of spinal cord is divided into 31 spinal segments, and from each spinal segment a pair of spinal nerve originate. There are basically 8 cervical segments from which 8 pairs of cervical nerves originate. Then we have is the 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar and 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal segment. And from these a pair of spinal nerve originate. So we have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerve, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral and 1 coccygeal. The cervical is basically involved in supplying and in controlling the sensation and motor activity of the upper extremity, and diaphragm, whereas the thoracic is basically involved in supplying the abdomen, trunk, and the head, whereas lumbar is involved in controlling the sensations and motor activity of lower extremity. And the sacral region is basically involved in controlling the bladder and bowel movement, and beside this is also control the genital functions. Here are the different nerves we are very familiar, for example, the musculoskeletal nerve, radial nerve, median nerve, sciatic nerve, tibial. These all are the spinal nerves. They all are originating from the spinal cord. Now let's see about the blood supply of the brain. The blood supply of brain is basically the vertebrobasilar system and the carotid system. Vertebrobasilar system basically supplies the brainstem, cerebellum, temporal occipital lobes, and the part of cerebellum. It basically supplies the posterior part of brain. Vertebrobasilar system originate from the subclavian artery and vertebral artery that unite and form the basilar artery. Basilar artery form right and left posterior cerebral artery, which we will show you in the circle of Villus. Carotid system supply the frontal, parietal and parts of temporal lobe. In short, it supply the anterior part of the brain. Carotid system originate from the aortic arch that become right and left common carotid arteries, divide and form internal and external carotid arteries. The circle of Villus. It connects the carotid and vertebrobasilar systems. Circle of Villus consists of anterior and posterior communicating arteries, and these communicating arteries has a great significance as they are the collaterals to the anterior and posterior sides of the brain. Internal carotid artery enter the cranium and form anterior and middle cerebral artery. This is the circle of Villus, in which you can see that the basilar artery is basically forming the posterior cerebral artery. And these are the pontine arteries, and these pontine arteries are basically supplying the pons, which is a part of brain, and it is also included in brainstem. The posterior cerebral artery are further linking with the middle cerebral artery through the posterior communicating artery. Now here we have is the middle cerebral artery, and on the interior side we have is the anterior cerebral artery. The anterior communicating artery is basically connecting the two anterior cerebral arteries. And on here we have is the internal carotid artery. If you want to remember this, just remember that this circle of Villus is like a hexagonal structure on which on one side we have is the posterior cerebral artery, on other side we have is the anterior cerebral artery, and on the lateral side we have is the middle cerebral artery, and on the medial cerebral artery's other part we have is the internal carotid artery. This is basically the circle of Villus, and it is of a great significance as is the circle and the collaterals, which are the anterior and posterior communicating artery. They basically helps to fight against the ischemia. Further we have is the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system we have studied basically consists of the brain and spinal cord. The next division of the nervous system was the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is basically an extension of central nervous system, which include cranial nerves and spinal nerves. These cranial and spinal nerves are either categorized into the autonomic or somatic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is the involuntary which basically control our heart muscles, smooth muscles, gland, GIT, our bladder, etc. Whereas the somatic nervous system control the voluntary skeletal muscles. Here I am going to give you an example from the cranial nerve. For example, the accessory nerve controls the head and the neck movement. And it is a somatic nerve as it supplies the skeletal muscle, which is a trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. Whereas if we talk about the vagus nerve, it supplies our viscera and it performs the autonomic function, involuntary function, and it is included in the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is further divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. Parasympathetic activates in the condition of rest and digest, mean parasympathetic activate in the condition of peace, whereas sympathetic activate in the condition of active and alert. Or we can say that sympathetic activate in the condition of stress. Autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system is basically thoracolumbar division of the autonomic nervous system, and it helps to prepare the body to cope with the stressful situations. It has afferent and efferent nerve fibers, and it basically helps in increase of the heart rate and blood pressure. It helps in the constriction of peripheral blood vessels, dilation of pupil, dilation of bronchioles, slowing of peristalsis, secretion of epinephrine and non-epinephrine by the adrenal medulla. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system is craniosacral division of the autonomic nervous system, conserve and restore homeostasis. It activates in the condition of peace. It also has afferent and efferent nerve fibers, and it basically helps in decrease of the heart rate and blood pressure, dilation of peripheral blood vessels, constriction of pupils, constriction of bronchioles, increasing of peristalsis and glandular activity. The next we have is the structural and the functional unit of nervous system, which is basically a neuron. Neuron is a cell which is differentiated from the other cells of the body because of its structure. Here we have is the structure of neuron. Neuron has two projections, which is basically the dendrites and the axons. This is the soma or the cell body which contain a nucleus. Around soma and cell body we have projection dendrites, which are basically responsible for receiving information. And second we have is the axon, which send information to the next neuron. The axon is covered with the myelin sheath, which is produced by the Schwann cells, and the part where myelin sheath is not present is known as the node of Rinwire, and the end part of the axon is known as the axon terminal. The axon terminal is further linked with the other neuron, and so on a chain continues. The connection between or the junction between two neurons is basically known as a synapse. And in general, the axon of one neuron combined with the dendrites of other neuron to make a chain, and this chain of neurons form a nerve fiber. And nerve fiber is basically responsible for forming a nerve. Next we have is a very important topic, which is the meninges of the brain and spinal cord. Meninges are the protective covering which cover the brain and spinal cord. The innermost layer is the pia mater, which is just present outside the brain and spinal cord. Then intermediate one is the arachnoid matter. The space between the pia and arachnoid matter is known as subarachnoid space. And the significance of subarachnoid space is that it contains the CSF. The outermost layer we have is the dura mater, and it is a tough and fibrous membrane. And on outside the dura mater we have is the bony part, which is the skull, and for the brainstem and for the spinal cord, that bony part is the vertebrae. Next is the ventricles. Ventricles are the special cavities which are present in the brain, and they are basically structures which forms and circulates the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is a fluid which basically protects the central nervous system, and it is also a medium of exchange. Lateral ventricles, the ventricles are four in number. There are two lateral ventricles which are basically large and irregular in shape, and they basically form the major amount of CSF. They communicate with the third ventricle. Third ventricle is present posteriorly and deep, and it communicates with the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle is located in the pons and medulla, and it further communicates with the subarachnoid space and the central canal of spinal cord where the CSF circulates. Thank you. That was the whole lecture. If you have any question, you can comment in the comment box. Thank you for your attention.